So once again, as Jesus reminds us that if our virtue, our spiritual life were to truly grow, then he said that virtue must be deeper than that of the scribes and Pharisees. And so in today's gospel, the heart of today's teaching is that Jesus goes straight to the real challenge of preserving a life of purity. And of course, the consequence of the sin of impurity for those who are married is adultery. And so it's important for us, once again, to try to understand today's gospel reading within context. We know very well that the sin of impurity and the sin of adultery and every other sin, in fact, not just only the sin of impurity, it begins always with the mind. The mind is what will is the beginning of sin. Of course, before the mind, we have the eyes first. The eyes first must see, and when something is presented to us in a sensual, enticing, attractive way, then the mind begins to imagine what they see and begins to what we call develop further. And what is conceived in the mind will eventually result in action. So everything begins, therefore, with sight, with the mind, before an action is done. And for this reason, if we have difficulties with the sin of impurity, or if we are tempted to sin in a general way, we need to be watchful of what we see, what we read. Because if we do not guard our eyes, then the mind will start working. And then all these, not only actually the eyes also, anything to do with touch, seeing, even smell will lead to this desire for the things that we should not have. And this is the reason why the devil tempts us, the world tempts us with all these images, because they know that an image is worth more than 1,000 words. And the devil wants to stir in us, especially when it comes to the sin of impurity, because all of us, we have a desire for sex simply because we are created in such a way. It is in our DNA. But if we do not manage it properly, what will result is not love. What will result is actually lust. And lust ultimately will destroy us. Destroy relationship, beautiful relationship, especially marriage. So how do we avoid, how do we overcome the sin of impurity, the sin of lust? Very simple. We just have to avoid the occasion of sin. That is the first step. Before we can even try to defeat the sin of impurity, the very first step is to avoid the occasion of sin. Of course, sometimes in certain situations, we cannot avoid. But normally, in most situations, that occasion of sin could be avoided. But we allowed ourselves to go into that situation. That is why in today's gospel, Jesus said, if your right eye should cause you to sin, take it out and throw it away. If your right hand should cause you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. For you will do less harm to lose one part of you than to have a whole body go to hell. So we need to think of the long term, because for the sake of a temporary pleasure, we destroy our whole life. We pay the consequences of our sin. And this is so true in relationships, beautiful relationships. Just because of the fact that we fall into one temptation, the whole family is destroyed. So the devil knows the sin of lust is a very powerful temptation that very few of us can resist. But we could resist if in the first place you avoid the occasion of sin. But if you lead yourself into the occasion of sin, then I can tell you honestly, it is extremely difficult to fight against sin of lust. Once you allow yourself to enter into it, you will say, I surrender all. That is the fact. Because your nature, not only your sinful nature, but even your biological nature, will not be strong enough to help you to resist sin. So, avoiding the occasion of sin is the basic step. What if we fall into the sin of impurity, or most of all, the sin of adultery, what do we do? Well, it is true that for most people, when their spouse commits adultery, the first thought is divorced. Well, it seems that it is the way of the world. In fact, it is the way of society since the time of Moses. So we need to think again. Jesus asked us to think deeper into this. Whether is it true that divorce is the answer to solve a marriage, a betrayal of trust? Of course, it is clear that in all relationships, not just friendship, but particularly in a marital relationship, the most important thing in a marital relationship is not even communication, it's trust. Once the trust is broken, no matter how much you try to repair the marriage, it would be extremely difficult, because once you lose trust, to regain that trust would take a very long time, even with all the counseling and the spiritual help. So that is why we need to avoid adultery at all costs. But then again, sometimes things do happen. People are weak. But for those of us who think that divorce is a solution, we need to think twice. I think the reason why many people think that divorce is the only way out is simply because they find that they can no longer trust in the person. When there is no trust, there is no communication. Then we will no more be truly genuine with each other. All that we say will be at a very superficial level. And the deepest things in our hearts we want to share, we cannot share, because we don't trust that person. And what is a relationship if there is no trust? No trust, therefore no love. It's a meaningless relationship. And so we think the way out is divorce. And sometimes couples do try, after a betrayal, to patch up the relationship, but it's extremely challenging. But if you take the road of divorce, there is also a danger that we think it's an easy road, but it's not an easy road. Both ways are difficult. If you are a single mother, you're a single father, it is also very challenging. And more so when you have children, more so. Then, the sufferings will also be very difficult. Although you don't have to face your spouse. You still can do certain things. But it's not to say it's easy. But for those of us, and I think the deeper problem is not when there is a failed relationship, they try to patch up, and they cannot patch it up, then the only way, especially when it becomes violent, and that's even worse. Sometimes the anger, resentment becomes so aggravated that there is violence. When violence takes place, then there is no way but separation. Even if it's not divorce, separation. But for those of us who takes this divorce and separation as an easy way out, there could be a deeper problem. Because, when you fail in a relationship, especially if you are the one who is the one who has betrayed your spouse, I can tell you honestly, if you betray your first spouse, the second one will be very likely as well. Because the real problem is with the person. If the person is not healed, if the person is not healed of his past wounds, his brokenness, he is going to repeat the mistake over and over again. Because the real problem is not with the spouse. The real problem is with him. Or some people in marriage, relationship, not just marriage, they don't last because they are not capable of relationship. The moment they have a relationship, they want to possess a person, they become demanding, they expect this, full of expectation, but they high expectations, and you are not realistic. It means to say you are very immature in the relationship. You do not know how to handle differences, to accept people's weaknesses, to accept what we call limitations of people. So, but for us Christians, for us Catholics, we know there is no divorce. And the reason is that Jesus, in Matthew 19, cites from Genesis itself. Since creation, God has created us, male and female, and because of that, we leave our parents, and the two become one. So, the Catholic Church interprets the marriage, the indissolubility of marriage, in a very absolute way. There is no divorce, in other words. So what do we do? But, today's gospel seems to give a way out. Because St. Matthew, actually it's only found in St. Matthew's gospel. St. Matthew says, if anyone divorces his wife except for the case of fornication. So it seems that there is a clause for divorce. The word fornication. But fornication, we have to go back to the Greek word, is porneia. Porneia means sexual infidelity or sexual sins or adultery. So it could mean adultery, it could mean sexual sins. So some Christian denominations would like to use these texts and say divorce is permitted if there is a case of adultery. Now the Catholic Church says this is not, the word fornication does not refer to sexual immorality or just simply fornication or adultery. This word actually is a reference to invalid marriages. Now, you must remember, St. Matthew was writing for the Jewish community, and there were Gentiles who were married, and they married under forbidden blood relationship. That means the brothers married a sister, not allowed. This is a blood relationship. So in those days, such degree, nowadays we make it clear, now it's not only a church law, but also government law, there are certain degrees of blood relationship you cannot marry. You cannot marry your cousin. Certainly cannot marry your sister or your brother. And so what happens is, what will happen when these people became Catholics, became Christian? So St. Matthew says, if they become Christian, then that marriage is not valid. So they can marry again. So that is how the church interprets this word. So regardless of how we interpret, whether divorce or invalid marriages, I think at the end of the day, the point is that still we must recognize there are struggles in married life. It is true. It's not easy. Getting married is not easy. Being a priest also not easy. Being single also not easy. Everything is not easy. So let me tell you first. Whether you are single, whether you are married, whether you are a priest, nothing is easy. Everyone has got his own challenges in life. So what about these marriages that really are struggling? There are Catholics who have difficulties in marriage and they really want to live up according to the teaching of Christ. Then I think we should take direction from St. Paul. Today he says we are only earthenware jars that hold this treasure. To make clear that such an overwhelming power comes from God, not from us. We are in difficulties on all sides, but never cornered. We see no answer to our problems, but never despair, and so on. So if you are in that situation, then the church advises, let us cling on to God. At the end of the day, if you can protect, preserve, or repair the marriage, it is the grace of God. You need to rely on God's grace, not just on your strength alone. But if you persevere, God will give you that grace. And I have seen it in many cases, especially many couples who attended CR, the Conversion Experience Retreat. Many couples were on the verge of breaking up, on the verge of divorce. And many of them, after encountering the love of God, His mercy and His healing grace, healing of their past wounds, they reconciled. And their marriage could now start on a new level because of their common love for the Lord. And because of the common love of the Lord, a greater awareness of their own sinfulness, their own limitations, then they can forgive. Otherwise, we think it's only the other person has done something wrong. But actually, if we are aware that we have our own struggles, our struggles are not the same. For some, it's a sin of lust. For some, it's gambling. For some, it's smoking. For some, it's drinking. They are different. So it's not to say that we all have the same sin. So you will be more forgiving. But of course, when it comes to relationship, because your wife can tolerate you for your drinking, gambling, all these kind of habits, But if there is no trust, then it's difficult to get the relationship moving. And that is why it's important for us. Today, we need to rely on the grace of God. And that is why St. Paul in today's second reading says, we have the faith, we believe, knowing that He who raised the Lord Jesus to life will raise us up with Jesus in our turn. And God can give us that grace. So we turn to the Lord in times of difficulties in our marriage life, in our relationship. And we ask the Lord to strengthen us and to help us and give us the grace to forgive each other all over again and to start anew, so that there is always this possibility for us to continue to communicate together and to build trust gradually. Amen.